Welcome to Wyrd Stories, a podcast of the paranormal, supernatural, where we will be covering strange occurrences, ghosts, UFOs, crypto creatures. Look out! Look in.
Our guest today is Dave Leidy. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
If you would please let the audience know a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm 55 years old, married with no children. I'm a retired IT professional and dog trainer, German Shepherds mostly. I was born and raised in the Philadelphia area, and I now spend winters in Pennsylvania and summers in Vermont. I'm an avid camper, hunter, and fisherman, at home in the woods and the mountains. As a Boy Scout and club explorer, I've done a lot of East Coast solo camping and some urban exploration. I'm now researching for the North American Dogman Project, and I've gone on some expeditions with the BFRO and done some of my own research into various paranormal issues.
You have a fascinating story to tell today, and I'm very eager to hear it in full detail. Please go ahead and feel free to tell. The floor is yours.
Okay. Well, I think it's important to this story to say that my great-grandmother on my father's side was of Lenni Lenape ancestry. This encounter happened long before I started researching anything, and it may have started me down that road. This experience remains extremely vivid in my mind, as if it happened only hours ago. Last year, while camping in Vermont, I related the story to a couple who was camping next to us. They were from Massachusetts and told me about Freetown State Forest and what was going on there. She also told me that what I had just described to them was what was disturbing people there. She called it a Pukwudgie, a guardian of the forest. So, when I was younger, I lived near Philadelphia. I used to go to Fairmount Park, which is Wemategunis Creek, within the boundaries of the city of Philadelphia. The park is about 20 miles long and about 6 miles wide at the most. It's unique as a city park that when you're in there, it feels as if you're more remote than you really are. So, it's a steep valley, and it used to be a colonial industrial mill area. The park has a long historical past and had involvement in the War for Independence. It was also sacred land to the Delaware tribe of the Lenni Lenape. One of my favorite spots in the park is called Mom Rinker's Rock. It has a Wikipedia page of its own if you wanted to look it up. Well, it's a finger of rock that sticks out from the hillside deep in the park. There's really only one way on or off, and the drop on all sides may not be sheer, but they are steep and treacherous. On top of the rock is an old statue of a Quaker, and engraved in the plinth is the word toleration. So, Mom Rinker was a tavern owner in Philadelphia during the British occupation in the 1770s. And she used to listen to the British officers talk in the tavern, and then she would pass the information in balls of yarn down to Jacob Levering and the Continentals who were camped in the creek area. And that's how the rock got its name. So, one night back in 1976, when I was 26, 4 friends and I went to Toleration before it got dark. We sat on the rock until late at night. All the guys with me, except one, I knew pretty well. One guy was named Andy, who didn't really believe in anything unless he could explain it. One was named Stan, who I swear was followed around by a dark cloud that used to zap him once in a while. Another was Andy's brother John, who was an adventurer like me. The last guy, Tony, we didn't know well, and as it turned out, he may have precipitated the encounter. He was the only one drinking, and he brought a beer with him. So anyway, we all climbed up on the rock, and were hanging out there. And an instant later, Tony threw his bottle off the cliff and broke it down on the rocks below. We all immediately rebuked him quite a lot, as it was an asinine thing to do here, where there wasn't much litter and where people hike. So while we were out there for a while, Stan came back from the woods and announced that there were eyes in the bushes. And we all laughed. I laughed because he was always saying stuff like that. But eventually I looked over, and sure enough, there were two human-sized points of greenish yellow light, and they blinked. About 15 or 20 seconds later, the owner of the eyes stepped into the moonlight. I'll tell you, I've never seen anything like this before, and the place got very quiet very fast. I have been trying to figure out what it was since that day. He was about 3.5, 4 feet tall and squatting. In fact, he walked in a squat. He moved that way till he was about 12 or 15 feet from me and then stopped and just stared at us. I thought at first it was a ghost, but it wasn't transparent, although at times he seemed to shimmer a little bit. I could see the shadow he was making on the ground in the moonlight, so he had substance. He looked kind of wet. His eyes were greenish yellow. His hair was long and damp looking. His face was human, but his nose was really long, almost over his upper lip. I never saw any teeth. He was wearing a vest that looked as though it was made of bones, and I think he was wearing a loincloth, but it might have been the skin too. His feet looked bare. There weren't any discernible toes, so he might have been wearing shoes. His hands were human, but his fingers were also very long. One hand was held like a fist with a stick in it that only protruded from the bottom of his hand, and there were beads and feathers hanging from the end of it. And he was shaking and moving the stick around. The other hand was empty, and he kept opening and closing it. He looked at each of us in turn and finally settled on me. He stared at me for a long time in silence. I really felt as if he was trying to say something, or to tell me something. I wasn't sure what it was exactly, but I kind of thought it might have something to do with the broken bottle. In my mind, even though I didn't do it, I expressed remorse. He didn't make any sound at all, not even on the dry ground. He just kept staring at me, and then he seemed to shake, almost like a wet dog does, but not as much. I have no idea how long we were there like that, but after a while, he shook again, rose up slightly, and left the rock. But he didn't walk away or move up the trail. He just moved to his left, our right. The path that he chose was directly off the rock, but he didn't fall. He just moved through the air, and we could see him passing in and out of the trees until he was out of sight. Needless to say, none of us moved for a very long time. We stayed there and compared notes, and everyone said the same thing, even Andy. No one felt what I did. They all just watched in silence. It was really incredible. So after a while, we finally decided to go home. When we did, no one wanted to be leading or in the back. So I finally took point, and we eventually made it back to the car without incident. No one was really frightened when we were all on the rock, only afterward. We never went back there at night again. And it wasn't long after that Tony and Stan were killed in separate car accidents. John went off to school, and Andy and I slowly went our separate ways. Though I am still in touch with him, but to this day, he will never talk about that night. I had dreams about it for years, and I did some research, but I never really found out very much. I have shared my story with a few people over the last few years, one of whom was in Vermont. I was staying at a state park there, and a woman told me that I had just described a pukwudgie. So that was the first time anyone had even the slightest recognition of who this god was, but much less a name. To me, it really didn't seem to fit. So recently, I was referred to and contacted a Choctaw medicine woman named Kat Hansen. She basically told me that it sounded to her like a Wemategunis. She was sure that's who we met, especially after she heard about the broken bottle. After thinking about it, she figured that he was curious as to why young men were on his rock during his hours. She went further. She said, so, young men, prime warrior age, were being disrespectful off of a major Earth energy focal point. As to why he was eyeballing me, she said that they tend to go for native blood when they can. Call it prejudiced or biased, or you can call it what she said, easier connection/remembrance for them from earlier times. They contacted and connected with most indigenous peoples on a one-to-one basis for thousands of years. He basically did a soul search through eye contact and saw that I meant no harm and that my friends were the same way. Also, that we got out of there without any damage to his area, so then he had no reason to rain holy hell down on us. On the other hand, if we had been found lacking, then he would have meted out some trouble by way of sicking some other prey or possibly an animal on us. And that was her evaluation. I looked up Wemategunis, and I found that they are Lenape forest guardians, or wood dwarfs. So I guess it all makes sense. I completely respect this explanation, and it seems to fit better than anything else I've ever heard or thought. I will tell you this, after that experience and the things that happened afterward, I embraced my slight heritage more and tried my best to walk away from youth pursuits and move forward. It's kind of like a wake-up call. And I'll tell you, my life improved immeasurably after that. I've never seen anything remotely similar to him again, even though I've crossed paths with other cryptids or spirits.
I wanted to ask you about the stick that he was holding. You mentioned that the stick was only coming out of the bottom of his hand, and but I was a little unclear as to where the feathers and things were. Can you describe that stick a little bit more?
Sure. So the stick was like a small branch without any other nodes sticking out or anything. And I'd say it was about no more than half an inch or 3/4 of an inch in diameter. And it was probably about a foot long. And he had it in his hand so that it was only sticking out the bottom of his hand. It didn't stick out the top of his hand. He just had his thumb over the top of his hand. And the stick itself was clear. It had no bark. And it wasn't polished, but it was trimmed up a little bit, I guess. And then there were feathers and beads that were hanging off the bottom of the stick with bits of twine or bark or something that was holding them on.
Okay. And when he was shaking it, did it make any noise?
None at all. In fact, even the beads hitting together didn't make any noise, which was really odd. But he tended to shake it back and forth and then forward and back and then around in a circle, and he seemed to repeat that motion.
Another aspect that I wanted to ask about was in regards to him looking wet. Was it like sweat, or did it look like he was dripping wet, like he just came out of the water? What can you describe that a little bit more?
Yeah, that was weird. Because when he first came out of the bush, the first thing I thought was it was a ghost. But then when I saw that he was making a shadow in the moonlight, then I knew there was substance there. And looking harder, his hair looked wet. Like it was maybe not wet, maybe just damp, because it was hanging and it was stringy, and it seemed that it glistened a bit. And his skin was, if I were to describe a color, I'd say like real light orange, like I don't know, Johnson's Children's aspirin or something. And at times it seemed that he shimmered a little bit, but not in a reflective way, just in a glossy way. And in that aspect, he looked kind of wet, but he wasn't dripping and he wasn't sweating. It just was more glistening than wet, I'd say.
I also wanted to ask you in regards to the way he walked away. So he went off to his left, which would be your right, and he went off of the rock?
Correct. The way he walked freaked me out from the beginning.
Yeah.
I guess I understood squatting in a bush, but when he came out of the bush, he was still squatting and walking that way, and that was really odd.
Yeah.
So when he was staring at us, and he seemed finally to stare at me, which kind of freaked me out a little bit. And after a while, I guess he decided that we were finished with whatever was going on, and he left the rock. Now, he didn't walk back or squat back or whatever you call it. He just turned to his left, our right, and walked off the rock as if there was a path there, as if the land just continued. And he just, in the same squat, walked off the rock, and then there was a tree right there, and he went behind the tree. And I thought, he'd be going down the slope, but he emerged on the other side of the tree at the same level when he left the rock. And that's about a 12-foot drop there at least. And just kept going through the air there. And as he got farther away, we could all see him going in and out of the trees until we couldn't see him anymore. And this was at night. So it was just moonlight, starlight, and whatever reflections off of the nearby water.
Okay, so there was water nearby.
Yeah, it's Fairmount Park is actually the Wemategunis Creek Gorge. So the Wemategunis flows through the gorge there. Wemategunis, the Lenape word for Wemategunis is muddy waters or catfish stream. And they like I said, there's a lot of mills set up there, and there's a lot of tributaries that come down from the side hills into Wemategunis Creek. And there's about 3 or 4 of them right there at the base of that rock. So there's quite a bit of water just in that area.
Okay. And where your friend or acquaintance threw the bottle, it landed on rocks. It didn't land in any water?
Correct.
Okay.
When you see this place, when you go to this place, it's the topography is like a very steep gorge, I guess is a good word for it, but there's like a lower trail and an upper trail where people have walked for I don't know how long. The other side of the creek, we were on the rougher side of the creek.
Okay.
The other side of the creek, there's an equestrian trail, and that's totally different. But on this side, there's a lower trail and an upper trail. There's a lot of rock formations, and then where we were was above the upper trail on the rock ridge. And when he threw the bottle, it must have gone down toward the lower trail and broke on the rocks just before the water.
Okay, and I apologize if I missed this when you were talking about this area in the beginning. Is this a national park or a state park?
No, I don't even think it's a state park. I think there might be historical areas within the park, but it's really a city park. Okay. In the confines of Philadelphia. I suppose that over the years, when the city was being developed, that there just was no way to develop anything in this place because of the steep hills. But it really was an important historical mill area. I know that the DuPonts got their start there. They had powder mills along that creek. And I know the Rittenhouse family had their start there as well, making paper. In fact, the paper from the Rittenhouse mills, they called it the whitest in the colonies because the water was so clear. So there was a lot of mills there of all kinds for a long time until that industry slowly died out. I think it's also important to say that the Lenape lived there for however long they were there. And they weren't exactly pushed out. They weren't forcibly removed. They left voluntarily when they saw that Europeans were going to be staying. They voluntarily uprooted and moved west.
Wow. It's a really interesting story about this creature because in some respects the way you describe him is like a spirit, and then in other aspects, it's, casting a shadow, and just the amount of detail, it makes it more like a real creature. So it's really odd. It's almost like something that's living in between this world and like another world. So
Yes, I thought the same thing, like an interdimensional creature of some kind. It struck me as strange too, because when you expect to see a spirit or a ghost, the features aren't as defined as usual. But this guy definitely had substance, and by casting a shadow, and the details of that he had were very striking. And even though this was over 25 years ago for me, well, about 25 years ago for me, the details stand out in my mind very, very well. It seems like it was just yesterday that this happened. And when I think about it, that's what I see. I can close my eyes right now and see him very clearly in my mind.
that's amazing. And approximately how long were you on the rock before he showed up?
I'd say we were there for about 2.5 hours. We got there just as it was getting dark, and it was pretty dark when he came out. So I'd say we were there about 2 hours, and I don't think much more than that. And I have no idea how long we were staring at each other. Time just stopped. I don't even know how long we sat there after he was gone. It just seemed like time wasn't important at that point. I can't even explain it. He definitely left an impression on all of us, and it seemed to be the same one to a point. And the fact that my friend that doesn't believe in anything saw it makes it even that much more real.
Definitely. And do you remember how the moon was? Was it way up in the sky? Was it a half moon? Can you describe the lighting a little bit more?
It's hard to say. It's deep in the woods, so it's hard to say with the canopy. But I do remember it being very bright, so it must have been at least a half moon. I don't remember exactly what it was. I think it was off the full. I don't remember it being a full moon, because I usually remember those things. But the amount of light coming through the trees was pretty good. You could see pretty well, enough to see shadows beyond the vast shadow of the trees.
Okay, so you must have been the park, I guess, is pretty far away from the city lights.
Yeah, the part we were at, like I said, it's about 20 miles long, so it follows the course of the creek from outside of the city all the way down to almost the center of the city by the art museum. And the width varies quite a bit, between a mile and, say, 6 miles. Where we were was pretty far back, almost to the city line. And between the amount of canopy that was there and our distance from the city, it was pretty dark. But at the same time, we were able to see.
Right.
The Philadelphia, in its respect as far as a metropolis, most of the lights in larger buildings are just all the way down near the center of the town. And when you get anywhere away from that, it gets pretty dark except for streetlights. There aren't a lot of tall buildings there. There's not as many as other cities.
Wow. Yeah, this is a really amazing story, and I wanted to thank you for telling it. And I'm very curious now to look up this particular creature, or I wouldn't call it a creature. It seemed like it's more man-like. Is that right?
Well, that's one of the things that really made me interested all along, is that I couldn't tell whether it was spirit or flesh or something in between.
Right.
Personally, I felt for a long time that it was a human that was there, just being whatever he was. But after a while, I dismissed that because of some of the other aspects of the story. I do feel that there was a connection somehow between him and I, especially toward the end of the encounter. Even my friends noticed that there was interaction between myself and this guy. I noticed it when we were there. People were looking back and forth between myself and him. And what I said before about feeling that it had something to do with the bottle, it's not like I had implanted feelings or voices in my head or my consciousness. It was just a general feeling of emotion more than anything. There was an emotion of annoyance coming from him, and I felt that it had something to do with the bottle. So I just thought to myself to apologize and and be remorseful. And it seemed to right after that the encounter ended. Yeah, really interesting. And I'll tell you, this encounter has stuck with me longer and with more intensity than other encounters that I've had. There are encounters that I've had that were spontaneous, that happened without me seeking them out. There have been encounters that I actually sought out or went with a group of people to check out, and some of them have been rather intense. But this one has really stood out in my life more than most of the others, more than any of the others, really, because of maybe because of where I was and who I was and where I was in my life that it happened.
Yeah, one of the things that gets me about it is that I've never heard of something like this, and yet there are names for it. So it just goes to show that, this is something that has, been visible to others for a very long time. Obviously, it seems like today it's very rare, but, for something like this to have a name that you can refer to and look up online and stuff, it's just really, it really kind of takes me aback, because I knew about, Sasquatch and some other cryptids and how their ancestry goes way back. The stories go way, way back. And this is something that I've never really heard about before, and yet there's a name for it, So.
Right. I understand completely, and I feel the same way, that these entities, and I believe, and there's hundreds of them. Every single tribe in the United States has, we'll call them legends, because that's what they call them. They call them Native American legends, or maybe we call them that. But they all have entities throughout their particular history of all different kinds of creatures or manifestations for different reasons, and they all have names. And they were very real to the people who lived here before, and they seem to be continuing to be real, as when I talked to Kat Hansen, she knew exactly what it was without looking it up.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose that different entities have different purposes for when they appear, or for when a certain activity will take place. There's a lot of entities in Native American literature that are mischievous, or that appear at a time when they're needed. Very interesting, almost biblical in a way. And if you think about it, that's what it is. It's a Native American spiritual religion, and the way that certain things manifest themselves, then they have an explanation. There was another point to the story that I thought was interesting that I did not mention. When I was talking about the Wemategunis leaving the rock, there was a report back in the late 1700s from a mill owner who said that Mom Rinker was a witch, and she used the rock for her midnight broomstick rides. And I thought, well, that's pretty funny. But when you think about it, if a man from the 18th century were to have seen what I saw, that might be the explanation he might come up with, which tells me that maybe I'm not the only one that saw this guy.
That is interesting.
I don't know.
But he was mentioning something that looked more female, is that right?
Yeah, but I don't know. We don't know any details about the story where they actually even saw the entity up close. It's just that area is called Mom Rinker's Rock, so maybe he thought that entity had something to do with the name of the rock.
Yeah.
I wish I had more information on the sighting, but I do know that I found it within the histories of the park. There's a couple of books written about the Wissahickon, and it was in there. There's a lot of things that happen on the rock. There's some stories about poets that had written some material up there, and there's a lot of different things about it. I know it's on Wikipedia. If you want to look up the history of the rock, and I think it's very superficial as far as its history, of course. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of places within Fairmount Park that have a lot of meaning to the people that lived there before us. There is a place we used to go swimming called Devil's Pool, and that's not very far from where we were. And we used to swim there all the time, not knowing that the history of the place in Lenape legend was it was a place where the Great Spirit defeated the evil spirit, and the thumbprint was left on the rock from the battle. And I know exactly what they're talking about, but I never looked at it that way, of course. And there's also a place called Council Rock, which is also near to that place, where it's like a natural cut rock back into the hill with almost like a pulpit back under the rock where you could stand and address maybe some people. And it's one of those rocks that's cut so when you speak, you project to everybody, to the entire area out there as if somebody's standing next to it. And that's kind of neat. Sort of like speaking into a half a dome. Right?
Oh, okay. So like a natural amphitheater?
Correct.
Nice.
There's a lot of neat places. There's a lot of interesting places within the park itself. There's a lot of neat places that were built afterward, of course. I know that deeper in the park is it's called the Kelpius Cave, where one of the founders of Rosicrucianism had his hermit cave back there, and that's preserved. There's a lot of interesting things that went on in Fairmount Park throughout the years, and I don't think we're ever going to even scratch the surface of that. As far as me, well, it seems I scratched the surface of something in order to have a Native American legend manifest itself to me.
Yeah, to all of you, which is amazing because a lot of times it is only to one person in a group, but in this particular case, everyone saw it. So,
yeah, that was interesting, and it confirmed the fact that it wasn't just somebody's imagination either.
Exactly.
Because there was a guy there that he didn't believe anything unless he could touch it, and to this day he won't talk about it. I guess it doesn't fit his narrative, but there was no question of its validity. There's no question that it was there. I mean, I have really tried to find an explanation over the years because it's always kind of with me a little bit. I always kind of remember it. And this woman I spoke to, Kat Hansen, was the one that had, I thought, the best explanation. The fact that she was able to name it right away meant a lot to me. And also that the encounter meant a lot to me in the way that kind of life-changing. Just kind of left behind a lot of the youthful things I was doing and moved forward at that point in my life. And also the people that were not moving forward, or the ones that were being disrespectful, their lives ended.
Yeah. That is really intense to think about.
don't know if it had anything to do with that, but it certainly points that way.
Yeah, it does, definitely. Yeah, but like you said, I mean, we can't be completely sure because this universe or this world just, there's obviously a reason for everything, but what those reasons are, it's hard for us or for me as a human to define exactly what that is, especially when we start talking about stuff like this.
Right. I agree. I don't. We're not in possession of the plan, so we don't know what the play is going to be. I do know that the two guys that are no longer with us were not on a good road, and whether or not the experience had anything to do with their demise, I don't know. But I do know that neither of them, on their present course, were going to get very far. So, like you said, could be anything.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I definitely have a lot to think about, and I definitely want to look up the park and Fairmount Park and find out more about the history there. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show, and thank you for telling the story. And I really appreciate it because it's just something new for, something new in the woods that can be potentially scary.
Well, it is new, and it's something I never heard from anybody else before, which made me think about it even more, as I couldn't relate to anybody else on it. And maybe there's people out there that can relate to this, but I've never met them. I appreciate you having me on because the story has a lot of personal meaning and value to myself, and I appreciate being able to tell it.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm glad I was able to provide the platform for you to tell a story.